I want to begin today by telling you a story. It's a story about a young man in his late teens, early 20s called David. Now, David is struggling, and he's struggling because he can't find any point to life. He can't find any meaning or purpose behind it. And as you might imagine, after a while, he began to feel very depressed. For him, all the color drained out of the world, and everything became flat and grey and pointless. He withdrew from the world, cut himself off from the people that he knew. He lived on his own, he didn't have a job, he didn't have any money, and before long his sleep patterns became very disrupted and he stopped taking care of himself. He even began to hear voices and see things that weren't there. A whole year or more went by like this, until David decided that he couldn't suffer anymore. Life felt like a constant torture to him, and he just couldn't see a point in carrying on, so he decided to kill himself. Now, for reasons best known to himself, he decided to do this by starving himself. He explained it to me once by saying that he just wanted to fade away. So as the days and weeks went by, he lost a great deal of weight. In fact, he lost half of his body weight. And then something very odd happened. It was his habit to say a prayer every time he went to sleep. In and of itself, that was a little bit strange because David was an atheist, but he was also desperate, and I think in desperation we reach out like a child reaching out for a parent. And it was always the same prayer. He'd lie down, close his eyes, and say, "Please God, just kill me. Just let this torture end. Just let me die in my sleep. Don't let me wake up." And he'd done this for months and months. But on this particular day, he lay down, closed his eyes, said his prayer, "Please God, just kill me." And in that moment, he felt that he was no longer in his room. And in that moment, he felt he was no longer even in his body. He felt that he was outside of his body, looking down on it, on a path lined by trees, heading off into a bright, shining light. And as he looked down on his body, he saw it start to walk toward the light. And he was filled with an absolute certain conviction that if he saw his body reach the light, then his prayers would be answered, and he would indeed die. But he also heard a voice, and the voice said, "You can come home now if you want to, but there are things that need to be done, and it would be better if you stayed and did them." And when he heard that voice, his heart melted, because it was filled with the most perfect love and the most perfect acceptance possible. Everything that he wanted and needed to hear. So despite how he felt, despite how desperate he was, he heard himself say, "Okay, I'll stay." And in that moment, he was back in his room, he was back in his body, and he was weeping like a child. Now, like I say, he was an atheist. So for about 4 days afterwards, he was walking around with his mind blown, thinking, "I can't believe it. God is real. God exists, and God loves me." But then after about 4 days, he began to question the whole experience. He began to rationalize it. He noted that he wasn't exactly the most reliable witness. He did have a history of hearing and seeing things that weren't there after all. And he began to think that maybe the whole thing was a spectacular rescue attempt launched by his unconscious mind, a kind of grand hallucination designed to snap him out of his downward spiral. Still, whatever else he could come to question or doubt, one thing remained a fact. After that strange and powerful experience, David began to get better. Didn't happen all at once or overnight, but steadily and surely, after that experience, he began to improve and to heal. So that's David's story. The reason I've told you David's story is because it's going to help me to illustrate some of the things that I want to talk to you about. Now, last week we heard a great message from Dave Roberts talking about the nature of mental health and illness and putting it into a Christian perspective. What I want to talk to you about is what you can do to find help if you're struggling with challenging thoughts, distressing feelings, and disturbing behaviors. And I'm also going to try and put this into a Christian perspective. Now, I've broken this down into 3 steps just to try and keep it simple. So step 1, recognize that you have a problem. Step 2, get past whatever anxiety, shame, or stigma might be keeping you back from asking for help with your problem. And then step 3, actually reaching out to others and accessing the help that is available to you. So let's go through those 3 steps, one by one, beginning with recognizing that you have a problem. Honestly, this can be tricky. In David's case, and in many people's cases, the problem started off as something completely ordinary and normal, and built up over time, getting worse and worse. When David first started to experience problems, it's because he was questioning the meaning and purpose of life. And that's actually quite normal, especially for somebody in their late teens or early 20s. And of course, we all have negative or upsetting thoughts and feelings. Of course we do. That's normal. That's part of life. But in David's case, he didn't realize that the path he was on would take him into such darkness. And he didn't notice the point on that path where his ordinary dissatisfaction and questioning turned into something more like deep existential despair. And this is a big problem. It's actually very difficult to know at what point ordinary unhappiness becomes depression, at what point ordinary anxiety becomes paranoia or an obsessive compulsive disorder, at what point a perfectly natural grief turns into a disorder, or even at what point a diet becomes an eating disorder or drinking alcohol becomes an addiction. David didn't notice that he had passed this kind of point until it was too late. And he's not unusual. Lots of people make the same mistake, failing to realize that their thoughts and feelings are taking them into danger, failing to realize that those thoughts and feelings have become a problem that needs help. Some people in this very room or watching this on camera might be making the same mistake right now. So what can we do? Well, I think there are 3 things. Firstly, we can get in touch with ourselves. As people say, we can become more aware of our thoughts and feelings and how to manage them. Secondly, we can realize that even if we're struggling with quote-unquote ordinary or normal levels of unhappiness or anxiety or whatever, it's still okay to ask for help and to seek support. And thirdly, we can find a way to notice this point on the path where some of our more challenging thoughts and feelings are becoming a significant problem, a problem that might be a mental illness. Now, as far as the first point goes, look, I think being aware of our thoughts and feelings and having ways to manage them is a really good thing for all of us, even if we're not struggling. In fact, it's a Christian spiritual practice. Ignatius of Loyola used to talk a lot about what he called discernment. So what is discernment? Let's say that a work colleague has just received a promotion, and your first thought is something like, I should have got that promotion. Well, then your second thought is probably going to be something like, oh wow, I can't believe I just thought that. I'm a horrible person. Why can't I just be happy for my colleague? But here's the thing. Your mind is a thought machine, and it generates all sorts of different thoughts about all sorts of different things all the time. Just because you had a thought does not mean that it reveals the deepest truth of your soul or the essence of who you are as a person. It's just a thought. So just because you had an uncharitable thought about your colleague does not mean that you have to take it to heart, invest in it, and say, this is who I am. Just because you had a horrible thought then does not mean that you're a horrible person. What Ignatius teaches us is that we can hold our thoughts sort of from at a distance. I'm just going to do that bit again. What Ignatius teaches us is that we can hold our thoughts sort of at a distance. We can just be aware that there are thoughts passing through our head. We don't have to grab a hold of them or invest ourselves in them or identify ourselves with them. You can picture these thoughts as if they're just so many clouds passing through the sky of your conscious mind. You can observe them, but you're not attaching yourself to them. Now, this will immediately have a calming effect, and it will mean that our thoughts and feelings have got less power to push us around and disturb us. But if you do this, something else will happen. You will see that some of these thoughts are moving generally in the direction of hope and positive transformation, while other thoughts are moving generally in the opposite direction, toward unhappiness and despair. So what you can do is discern the difference between these two different kinds of thoughts. Once you've done that, you can claim the ones that are positive as your own, as being thoughts that you want to take to heart, that you want to invest in and identify with and say, yes, this is me, this is who I am. And you can leave the other thoughts at a distance. Just a cloud floating through your mind. Don't try and push them out of your head. Don't get upset when they pop back up into your mind. Just observe them and let them pass. After a while, they'll have a lot less power to disturb you. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean that you ignore every thought that makes you feel bad. In schools and workplaces, we've gotten used to thinking about constructive criticism. And if your thoughts are providing constructive criticism, then that's no bad thing. That's how we learn, that's how we grow, that's how we move towards positive transformation. And as Dave Roberts pointed out in the last message, sometimes unhappiness and anxiety can be positive things. They can be feelings that we need to go through, that we need to move through. They can be feelings that carry some kind of a message for us, telling us something important. It's the thoughts that are critical but not constructive that we want to let go of. Thoughts like, I'm no good. I'll never amount to anything. No one loves me because I'm fundamentally unlovable. And we can also think here of thoughts that are spiritually problematic in other ways. Thoughts that are full of egotistical pride or jealousy, for example. Now, in my personal opinion, this technique of discernment is a very useful spiritual practice. It helps us to become familiar with and weed the garden of our minds. It can be very helpful if we have decisions to make as well, working out which option is moving in this direction towards positive transformation and hope, and which options might be moving you more in this direction towards unhappiness and despair. But it can be particularly helpful when we're trying to manage challenging thoughts and emotions. In fact, I used to know a young woman called Jess, who'd struggled with depression and anxiety for a long time. And in order to manage these difficult feelings, she'd actually turned to cutting herself. Now, after several very bleak and difficult years, she used Ignatius's technique of discernment to find a more positive way to manage her thoughts and feelings. And she was actually able to stop cutting herself and move toward a happier and more stable frame of mind. There are other ways of managing, of course, and different things work for different people. Spending time in nature or by the sea, perhaps. Doing art, writing your thoughts and feelings down. Exercising, spending time with good friends. You have to find what works for you. But whatever does work for you, I think it's very important that we have ways, whatever they might be, of becoming more aware of our thoughts and feelings and having a way to manage the more difficult thoughts and feelings that we have. Okay, the second thing on that list, the second thing that we can do, is come to realize that even if the thoughts and feelings that we're struggling with don't constitute a mental illness, but are in a sense the fairly ordinary or normal challenges of thought or mood that we all experience from time to time, then it's still okay to talk to someone, to lean on a friend, to bring it to your community, to find support from a faith leader, even to talk to a therapist. You don't have to wait until full-blown mental illness is breaking down your door to reach out and ask for help and seek support. Now, compared to that first point, this second point is a really short point to make, but it's also a really important point to understand. You don't have to wait. You can ask for help. Anyway, the third thing that we can do is find a way to become more aware of that hard-to-notice moment when these sorts of challenging thoughts and feelings are becoming a problem that might constitute a mental illness. And we really should seek help to deal with them. Now, like I said, it's very hard to know when ordinary feelings become a problem. But there is a pretty good rule of thumb that we can use. If a problem becomes so bad that it interferes with your daily life, that it interferes with your normal routines, that it interferes with your relationships or your work or your interests, then it may be a mental illness. And it is at least worth taking that problem to a doctor. This is important, so I'm going to say it again. A good time to go and consult a doctor or talk to a therapist is if some problem with your thoughts, your feelings, or your behavior becomes so bad that it interferes with your daily life and your normal routines. If there are things that you would normally do that you're not doing because of this problem. And the problem doesn't have to be severe in order to interfere with your life. I used to know a guy who had a phobia of thunderstorms. Now, he was healthy in every other respect, but he would cancel plans with friends if he thought that it was going to storm. If it was thundering while he was at work, he would go and hide in the toilets, and then he'd get into trouble with his boss for being absent from his desk. And he'd experience a kind of anxiety or even dread as the seasons changed and summer came round, bringing with it an increased threat of thunderstorms. That wasn't a huge problem, but it was interfering with his life. So he went to see a therapist, he put in the work, he recovered from his phobia, and he never regretted asking for help. Okay, so that's the first of the 3 steps. How to recognize if you have a problem. Be aware of your thoughts and feelings. Accept that it's no bad thing to ask for help if you're struggling with ordinary but difficult thoughts and feelings. And in any case, accept that you will need help if those thoughts and feelings are beginning to interfere with your life. However, you can recognize that you have a problem and you can accept everything that I have said so far and still not go out and seek help. So let's move on and talk about overcoming whatever anxiety, shame, or stigma might be holding you back from asking for help. And here again, David's story is instructive. Even when his questions about the meaning of life had deepened into depression, he didn't look for support, and he didn't ask for help. In fact, he isolated himself from the people that were around him. What he didn't seem to understand is that if he'd only reached out and connected with people, if he had opened up and talked to someone, if he had allowed himself to access the help that was on offer, then he might have avoided the worst of what was to come. And David's not unusual. A 2004 report by the World Health Organization found that between 30 and 80% of people with mental health issues do not ask for help and do not seek treatment. So why is that? Well, there are a number of reasons. Simple denial is one of them. Alternatively, some people aren't sure how to access help. Some people are afraid of what might happen if they do access help, especially medical help. Some people are so depressed or anxious that asking others for help seems impossible to them. And some people simply feel too hopeless to see any point in asking for help. They believe that nothing will help them and that they will never get better. And that was part of David's problem, for sure. But he had another problem, which I think is also a very common one. To a certain extent, you could say it was pride. His problem started when he was in his late teens and he had only just left home and started to live on his own. And he simply didn't want to admit that he couldn't manage on his own. But there was more here than just that obvious kind of pride. Our contemporary culture is very individualistic. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves to stand on our own 2 feet, to make something out of ourselves, to make our own way in the world. The result can be that if we can't manage on our own, if in fact we do need help or support, then it's all too easy to feel like a failure, to feel like we have failed in life and failed as a person. And that really gets to the heart of it, because David felt that he was a failed person. As if good, healthy, normal people shouldn't need help. As if good, healthy, normal people shouldn't need anyone else's support or help, shouldn't need comfort, shouldn't need things from other people that they can't get for themselves. I suspect that we can all relate to some degree to that attitude. But I also suspect that we all know deep down that it's just not true. That's not what human beings are like. We are fundamentally social animals. We are relational creatures who naturally form communities of mutual care and support. Psychological researchers have used what are called social deprivation experiments, where you basically isolate somebody for an extended period of time. And what they've found is that when you isolate people, they don't do very well. In fact, social isolation alone can be a cause of mental illness. We thrive when we live our lives together, when we can rely upon each other and help each other out. And of course, this is a Christian message. The importance of relationship runs all the way through Christian teaching. Even our idea of God is all about relationships. The Trinity, the relationship between God the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus tells us that the essential commandment is to love God and to love one another. But here's the thing. That means not only that we should love, but also that we should accept the love of others, to love and be loved. And in John's Gospel, Jesus tells us that we are to serve one another. But again, this necessarily means that we are not only to serve, but that we are to accept the service of others, to serve and be served. If we cannot do both, then a community of love and service cannot work and cannot exist. If we're all trying to serve one another, but not one of us will accept service from another, then obviously that community can't hold together. The kingdom of God, it seems to me, is not just about people giving help to others, but also receiving it. Our prideful individualism, then, could all too easily shut us out of God's kingdom. So I think as Christians, we should accept our dependence upon one another and understand that counter to all the messages of this world, the kind of weakness that leads us to need help, that leads us to have to ask other people for help, is actually a spiritual strength. Just as Paul realized in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, when he reports a lesson from God, saying, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." If we need help and ask for help, it does not mean that we are failed human beings. And if we need help and ask for help, it most certainly does not mean that we are failed Christians. We heard last week this idea exists. As we heard last week, there is this idea that if you have a deep and genuine faith, then you won't have these kinds of problems. And if you do have these problems, then it must be because you don't have a deep and genuine faith. But all you have to do to find the opposite opinion is open a Bible. Just read about the suffering of Job. Or listen to the writer of Ecclesiastes, who at times sounds like he's depressed. Or listen to the voice of the Psalms. sometimes full of joy and celebration, for sure, but also often full of anger, fear, and despair. And remember Jesus' own tribulations in the wilderness and in the Garden of Gethsemane, when, according to Mark's Gospel, Jesus was distressed and agitated and told the disciples that he was deeply grieved even to death. Or most famously in Matthew's Gospel, when Jesus seems to fall into despair on the cross, crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The great tradition of Christianity has always recognized the joy of faith. Of course it has. But at its best, it has never mistaken that faith for an antidepressant. And it has always accepted that into each life, no matter how faithful or spirit-led, there will be difficulties and there will be suffering. If we are to try to be as recklessly open to this world as Jesus was, then I don't see how it can be any other way. There's a telling moment in John's Gospel, in chapter 11, when Jesus sees that Lazarus has died, and he cries. Now, he must have known that he was going to bring Lazarus back from the dead, but he still cries. He still allows himself to feel human loss and human grief, even though that sadness is held within the arms of his divine vision. The promise we have as Christians is not that faith in God will stop us from wanting to cry. Rather, the promise is that, as Revelation says, when God's purposes are fulfilled, then God will wipe every tear from our eyes. And until then, as Matthew's Gospel tells us, Jesus is Emmanuel, which means God with us, even when we're crying. So until God wipes every tear from our eyes, then it's okay to cry. It's okay to feel broken, just like the psalmists. And it's okay to need help. It does not mean that we lack faith or that we are bad Christians and failed God. Nothing could be further from the truth. But even if we accept that we need help, that it's okay to ask for help, there is still one last thing to consider. And that is how to actually access the help that is on offer to you. Now, if you've been paying attention, you might think that I've backed myself into a corner here. After all, I've been relying on David's story. And in David's story, he doesn't seem to access help. He prays, and his prayer results in a strange and powerful experience. And that seems to bring something almost like a miraculous healing. But actually, this was the main reason why I picked David's story. We are people of faith, after all. And we have to believe that God can bring us healing and wholeness. And I think that is illustrated by David's story. But the question isn't whether God can heal us, but rather how God heals us. Remember that David came to doubt whether he had heard the voice of God. He thought that he'd probably heard the voice of his own unconscious mind, trying to snap him out of his downward spiral. And maybe he was right. But maybe it doesn't matter. It reminds me of an old joke, and it's a bad joke as well. In fact, it's such an old, bad joke, I'm willing to bet that everybody listening to this has heard it. But I'm still going to inflict it upon you, because it's going to help me to make a point. So a man climbs onto his rooftop to escape a flood. It's that joke. Once up there, he can see that he's surrounded by water, and so he begins to pray for help. Soon after that, a man in a rowboat comes by and shouts, "Jump in, I can save you." But the man replies, "No thanks. I'm praying to God, and it is He who will save me." So the rowboat goes away. Then a motorboat comes by, and the man in the motorboat shouts, "Jump in, I can save you." But again, the man on his roof replies, "No thanks. I'm praying, and God will save me." And so the motorboat speeds away. Then a helicopter flies overhead, and the pilot shouts out, "Grab this rope, I will lift you to safety." And once again the man replies, "No thank you. I'm praying to God, and I have faith that it is He who will save me." and so the helicopter reluctantly flies away. Soon after that, the water rises over the rooftop and the man drowns. He arrives in heaven and he can't believe what has happened. He says to God, I had faith in you, but you didn't save me. And God replies, I sent you a rowboat, a motorboat, and a helicopter. What more did you expect? It's entirely possible that David's experience was produced by his own mind. But it is also entirely possible that God was working through David's mind in order to save him. And the truth is that while David did start to improve after that experience, it didn't happen overnight. In fact, it took a couple of years of hard work before David could consider himself to be well again. And during that period, he did indeed ask for help. From family and friends, from a local community, not a church community, because remember he was an atheist, but a gym community where he found some of the same benefits we would hope to find in a church. People who knew him, who accepted him, who seemed always happy to see him, and who gave him a place to belong. And he also went to see counselors and therapists. Here's the point. If we can see God working through David's own mind to save him, then we can also see God working through his family and friends, through his community, and the counselors and therapists that he went to see. We believe in an infinite God after all, a God that is within, behind, and beyond everything that exists. That includes rowboats, motorboats, and helicopters. And it also includes the people who care for us, the community that welcomes and accepts us, the therapists, nurses, and doctors that know how to take care of us, and yes, even the medication and treatments that they prescribe for us. So pray for help, just as David did, just as the man on his rooftop did. But don't limit your sense of spiritual imagination to only the most obvious miracles. If you believe in Jesus, then you believe that God acts in this world. But it seems to me that God's preferred mode of action is other people. So help may come as a divine voice full of love and acceptance. But it equally might come as a voice on the other end of a telephone line, or in the form of a person who is willing to just sit silently and hold space with you while you cry or say nothing. Or a community that welcomes you and accepts you and creates a new home for you. Or even a doctor listening to your symptoms, working out a diagnosis, and finding a treatment plan that can give you the help and support that you need. I think God is behind all acts of genuine healing, no matter what form they take. Finding help, then, does not have to be a step away from the path of faith and discipleship. We can bear witness to the gospel in recognizing our problems and our problematic thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, in finding spiritual strength in the very weakness that means that we must turn to others and ask for help, and in finding God in all things and all people and all experiences of help and support and healing. And if, from where you are right now, if from how you're feeling right now, healing feels more like an unbelievable fantasy than a reality, then I have two last things to say before I finish. The first thing is a small confession. My middle name is David, and the story that I have told you is my own. I was that young man, depressed and psychotic and suicidal, starving myself to death. I was that young man who heard a voice that he couldn't make sense of, but that gave his life meaning and purpose. And I was that young man who spent the next 2 years slowly but surely healing from my problems. And 25 years later, I stand here before you, talking about it as if it happened to somebody else. I was healed, and I've come to see God behind that healing. And the second thing I want to say is that if you're suffering today, please remember that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. Because through Jesus, God is with us even during our suffering, even in the valley of the deepest shadows, even when you don't think that you can take any more. God is here with you now, living within you, loving you, holding you, and wanting you to find help, health, and wholeness.